Okay. Welcome to our March webinar. Good afternoon. And the webinar today will be the essential estate planning document you've never heard of. I'm Carrie Fristo, and I'll be the moderator. Today, Frank Napolitano will talk about an often overlooked document you can use in your estate plan to help clarify your wishes. Frank Napolitano is a senior financial advisor at Sensible and has a BA from Harvard University and a JD in business and financial law from Boston University School of Law. He is a certified financial planner certificate and a chartered financial analyst charter holder. Frank is also a member of the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors and the National Association of Divorce Professionals. You can see all of our past webinars on Sensible Financial's website at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. You can also register for upcoming webinars through the link in our newsletter, which will come out later this week, or same thing, sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions in the Q&A link at the bottom of your window. Frank will answer as many questions as he has time for. He can't give personal advice because he doesn't have the context to do so, but his contact information will be displayed at the end, so you'll be able to contact him personally if you need questions. Okay, take it away, Frank.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning if you're here on the West Coast. Frank Napolitano. I'll be speaking about the essential estate planning document you've never heard of, or maybe you have heard of. If you've worked with me in the past, I've probably mentioned it a bunch of times, but you've never done anything about it, so you're here on this webinar. I am going to stick to an agenda here. We're going to talk about the role of the letter of instruction in an estate plan. I should mention here at the beginning, a letter of instruction or letter of intent, that they mean the same thing. I use letter of instruction. I just find that the word is a little more broader in scope. I think it makes more sense to me. But if you hear those two, just understand it means the same thing. I'm going to talk about what to include in a letter, at least or the way I would think about structuring a letter and sort of what to include in that letter. And finally, I'm going to have at the end of this sort of a page on getting started or tips for how to actually do this. My goal here is to educate, but also that people take away from this webinar sort of actionable steps that they can take now, sort of on the path to getting something like a letter accomplished, or some of the prerequisites for that letter accomplished in relatively short order. So I'm to begin with sort of describing sort of the estate plan at the high level. What is an estate plan? I will just sort of plug my previous webinar on the basics of estate planning, or estate planning 101, covers this in much more detail. So if you are finding there's some gaps in your knowledge here, or if you haven't seen that webinar, I encourage you to go to our website, go to our YouTube page, and you can watch the whole webinar there. But so let's start with an estate plan, right? So, what is an estate plan? I think about an estate plan as a set of documents a set of formal documents, I should say, or legal documents that, one, spells out how to transfer property after someone has passed away, and two, provides instructions to those you've selected, your delegates, if you will, to manage your affairs upon death, or if you become incapacitated. Furthermore, I like to think about sort of this framework for estate planning documents. I don't know if anybody else uses this, but I just find this a useful way to sort of plot the various elements of the estate plan along a spectrum. And on one end, we have transfers of property, and on the other, we have those instructions for our delegates. So all the way on the left-hand side, we'd have something like will substitutes. So this would be like a beneficiary designation on an IRA, perhaps, designation on a life insurance policy, things, bank accounts, certain other accounts and assets can be held, for example, transfer on death, title. And so these are sort of pure transfers of property, right? There's no instructions going on here. This is simply, upon my death, the ownership interest that I own in this property is now transferred to somebody else. Further to the right of that somewhat is a will. So wills deal mostly with transfers of property, right? Most wills you'll open up and read through primarily function as a way of saying, here's my probate estate, and here's what I want to do to dispose of my probate estate, if you will, but includes some other instructions as well. There are trusts sort of run the gamut. They can run all the way much closer to pure transfers of property to purely instructions for people. So trusts are very flexible instruments. A durable power or a financial power of attorney. This is the instructions for someone to manage your financial affairs if you were unable to do so. And a healthcare advance directive, again, somebody to make healthcare decisions for you if you weren't able to. And that, again, is sort of purely on the instructions for delegate side of things. You'll notice there is no letter of instruction on this list. That's because the letter, in fact, is not a formal estate planning document at all, right? Hence the estate planning piece you've never heard of. Based on my experience, anyway, it can be a very important part of somebody's estate plan, even if it's not a formal document. So let's talk a little bit about what is a letter of instruction and sort of why is it important? How could it help you? So a letter of instruction, again, it's an informal document that can provide non-binding guidance and instructions to your important people in your life. Perhaps it's to your executor or your personal representative. Perhaps it's to a trustee. Perhaps it's to beneficiaries. I'll be clear, I don't get into this in this webinar in detail, but some professionals out there would say, actually consider writing different letters for different audiences, right? So there's one letter for an executor, which has a lot more detailed information. There's a separate letter for beneficiaries, but just be aware, this is a very flexible instrument. So there's lots of ways of putting this into writing. These letters are not legally enforceable. I think that's very important. So we're not involved in legal practice of law when we write these letters down. And if the letter conflicts with something you have in a document like a will or a trust, those documents are going to hold. So think about this as adding instructions in addition to what's in those documents, or clarifying perhaps things in your formal estate planning documents. And it's usually written without the help of an attorney. I'll point out where I think there is a major exception to that. And if you can get your attorney to help you with that element of the letter, I think it can be very, very useful. And so what can a letter do? I think the way I think about it, so three primary objectives here. So number one is it can serve as a plain English description of your estate plan. It can translate it from what can seem like a foreign language of legalese and legal speak into plain English. Number two, it can provide details that are not covered elsewhere. So the estate planning documents from the other slide do not cover everything that has to do with your estate. And there are things you will have to invariably write about and sort of give people more details about outside of those documents. And this is one way to do that. And lastly, you can add a personal touch. If you've done an estate plan, if you read through your will, or if you read through your trust, you may find that it's not the warmest document you've ever read. And so the ability here to pass on some values, to pass on some thoughts as to why perhaps you structured your estate plan the way you did, that can be accomplished with a letter of instruction. And before we really get into it, I thought I like doing these Zoom polls. It helps me get a sense of my audience and sort of where people are. And so we're just going to have one of these during this webinar. So here we are. So my question for you, the audience today, is, do your friends or family understand how your estate plan is supposed to work? And there are three options here. And so I would say choose the best one, right? So the people who need to know have a detailed understanding of my estate plan. Two, we've reviewed the plan together and they have a high level understanding. They sort of know what's going on. Or three, no, we've never discussed the details. So please just take 10 seconds here, 15 seconds here, and let's try to get as much answers from you all as possible.
A lot of people are answering. We're almost everyone so far.
Great.
So it's wonderful. I think we might have hit everyone who's going to answer, just about anyway. About 86% of the people have participated, which is wonderful.
Good. That's a good batting average. What are the results?
Most of the people have not discussed the details of
Most
their
of the
estate
okay.
plan. Yeah.
Right.
55% have not, and 30% have reviewed at a higher level. And only 15% have really told everyone everything they need to know.
Okay. All right. Perhaps prove my point here to some degree. So let's get some advice from Al, right? He's a smart guy. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. One of the points of estate planning here, right, should be that it works for us, and it makes the lives of those who survive us easier. And I would argue that if the people who need to know the details of your estate plan, certainly the people who will be responsible for organizing your estate, perhaps, if they're a personal rep or executor, managing your probate estate in that process, these people really need to know, what the estate plan is, and how it's supposed to work, where the documents are located. And so this part of the letter is about creating a useful summary. And I think it's useful for ourselves, right? So we can, return to our estate plan perhaps years later and remind ourselves, all right, this is what we said we were going to do. These are the instruments we use to get us from A to B, but also instructions for our loved ones, for those who survive us, so they can quickly find out what the estate plan is, what it's supposed to accomplish, etc. So the first part of the letter is about simplifying the complex. And estate planning documents, I say here, can be complicated. Cross that out. Estate planning documents are complicated. They are complicated for at least 3 reasons. Right, so one, estate planning documents often use archaic language. I hereby revoke prior wills or codicils, named or otherwise heretofore, sui jurises, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I was in law school, we were trying to excise this type of language from documents, but it's a habit, and it persists, and especially for estate plan, perhaps it was written by an older attorney or something like that. It may just seem almost impenetrable with this silly legalese and old Latin phrases. 2, right? A good estate plan, a good estate planning attorney is going to try to future-proof that estate plan. So it's going to include or anticipate, future changes to things like the tax law, future changes to your personal circumstances. And so maybe a trust is established. If the future estate tax exemption is such and such amount, or my estate is below that amount, go and create a trust over here. Otherwise, transfer my property directly to my spouse, or your estate plan anticipates leaving your property to your 2 children. But if one of your children predeceased you, what would happen in that event? Would it go to their surviving spouse? Would it go to set up education funds for your grandchildren? So there's complexity because, in fact, lives are complex, and estates are complex, and families are complex. And even if the estate plan is very well written, using very straightforward language, and it's a relatively simple estate, relatively simple set of circumstances, estate planning necessarily deals with concepts that people are unfamiliar with. If you've ever been an executor or executrix, if you've ever been a trustee or beneficiary on a trust, there's complexity to these instruments, right? And most people will not have a good understanding of the probate process until they've gone through it. People won't understand how a trust is sort of operates until they are now a party in a trust, either as a trustee or a beneficiary. So there are just complexities that are unavoidable with estate plans. But this is an opportunity, right? So the first thing I think a letter of instruction can do, and it can do very well, is to simply simplify or translate that estate plan into something useful, into something comprehensible. So again, I want to make clear that It's not that the letter replaces or supplants anything in a estate plan. It's about making something that's complex into something that is comprehensible. I think about this as sort of cliff notes with a personal touch, right? If you think back to the last time you had to work on a professional designation or study for a test, you probably took complex information and had to distill it, had to take notes, had to put it in your own words, to take a lot of dense material and make it digestible. That's what I think a letter of instruction can do and sort of meet this objective. This is the one part I think where an attorney can be helpful. And I'll say, I've worked with attorneys in the past, and I find it very, very useful when the attorney writes a cover letter. So, client finishes an estate plan, and there's a cover letter that attends the trust document, let's say, that describes, what happens on somebody's incapacity or death, right? Or a letter that accompanies the will and says, this will goes through the probate process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That can be very, very helpful. Not to say that, your loved ones in the future will not need the help of an attorney. They almost certainly will. But to know what's going on, to know how that estate plan is, and to communicate it to those people in advance, I think can be extremely helpful, essentially, so that everybody is on the same page. I'll say this, right? If the attorney won't write this, if you've sort of lost touch with the attorney over time, you try to write this ideally at the time of updating the estate plan, right? Because the details will never be as clear as when you are, putting that plan in place. With that said, if you can go back to the documents, if things are clear enough, I would strongly suggest, flipping through your notes, if you have any, going through those documents and working on a summary. And here's my very, very simple example. This is overly simplified. This would not be sufficient, I do not think, but to give you a sample of what I mean by a simple summary, right? So let's describe a simple estate plan. So my estate plan uses a will to distribute my property when I die. I've selected my brother Tom as my personal representative, and if he can't do it, Aunt Carol. All of my assets are going to flow through probate. My intention is to simplify the estate settlement process for my survivors. So again, how does this estate plan operate? And a little bit as to the intention, right? If people are wondering, well, why probate? Well, in this case, my idea was to create as simple of estate plan as possible for my survivors. What am I doing with my property, right? My children are equal beneficiaries of all my property, except $50,000, which I donate to the National Institute of Mental Health. And again, you might take the opportunity in this letter to write something briefly about why you chose the National Institute of Mental Health. And finally, where is the estate plan, right? I filed my official will with the local probate court. This is in this jurisdiction, you're able to do that. You can also find a copy in my home safe. So again, your letter, your summary is going to be longer than this. I think it's going to be more complex than this very simple example we have here on the page. But to give you a sense of, helpful instructions for this is what we did, this is how it's supposed to do and supposed to operate and why. This is where to find this important document. Very, very, very useful. And very few people I find actually have something like this written down. And so please, if it's more likely to get it done with the help of an attorney, find that attorney, ask them to write it for you, and they can do this yourself. You get started on it and put it in a safe place with the rest of the letter, which I'm going to get to now. Okay, so another objective, the second objective I would think for a letter of instruction is the ability to sort of fill in the gaps of an estate plan. So this may sound odd, right? But wills, trusts, financial powers, healthcare proxies, living will not cover your entire estate. Okay, let's take the example of a will, right? So I cover this in more detail in my basics of estate planning webinar. Wills can do lots of things. Some of the things wills can do is distribute property, designate a guardian for minor children. It can identify an executor, personal rep. Those are just synonyms. It can establish a trust. But there are some things that a will cannot do. Okay. A will is meant to address the probate estate. That is the part of somebody's estate which goes through probate, goes through the court process of probate. But wills do not address non-probate property. And non-probate property can be huge. It can be larger than the probate estate. Take the example of a young couple. They have very few assets, very few savings. They're starting their lives, but they have large life insurance policies. If they passed away, those life insurance policies are probably passing outside of the probate process and maybe establishing a trust. Maybe they have it owned by what's called an island, which is just a special type of trust. The instructions in the will be useless for that life insurance or that life insurance trust because that life insurance was never part of the probate estate, right? The will never touched it. Take people who are, retirees. They have very little in cash, but they have large retirement assets. Those retirement assets are probably written with beneficiary designations of natural persons. They're meant to go directly to people and avoid the probate process. The instructions in a will won't attach. They won't tell you anything about the distribution of those assets out of the IRA, the intent of leaving those assets to whomever. So the estate plan, formal estate planning documents as they exist do not cover everything. There are some other things wills can't do. So while it's not illegal to put funeral plans in a will, there's a timing problem here. Wills are generally not read until after a funeral. But only executors are able to read a will beforehand. So putting those funeral instructions might be futile in this case. There's probably a better place, I would argue, to put funeral instructions. Something that is illegal to do in a will is leaving property to pets. Who knew, right? But if you have pets and you have plans for taking care of those pets after you're gone, you have to put those instructions somewhere. And I would argue that the letter of instruction is a sort of an obvious place to do so. And lastly, I say putting it all together. It is one thing to say in a will or in a trust, I leave my financial assets to my surviving children. It is another thing altogether to track down those assets, in particular if there are lots of different bank accounts or lots of different custodians or 401k accounts. The letter can be, I really think, invaluable to helping our friends and family quickly sort out the estate, understand the details of that estate, and help people by avoiding wasting time and sort of tracking down things. So what to include in that letter? Here's some suggestions here. There's a lot you could potentially include, but I want to sort of fit everything in digestible chunks here, and so I've sort of limited to what I could fit on one slide. Contact information, important contact information. So if you were hospitalized, if you passed away, right, there are professionals who you have in your life that could perhaps help your survivors in important ways. So say financial advisor, an accountant, an attorney, but also contact information for friends and family. If you live away from family, you have a tight-knit community of friends. If you were hospitalized and you would want certain people to be notified of that, well, if it's not organized, those people may never be contacted, or to try to find that contact information from lots of bits and pieces all over the place would complicate the lives of your children or your friends, your other family. So think about organizing important contact information for friends, family, and certain professionals, right? A list of assets. Again, take the example of I leave my financial assets to my surviving children. Well, tracking down those assets will be very important. Somebody will have to do that. So make it easy on your family, whoever's job that will eventually be, by you could create a simple spreadsheet for financial accounts and real property. This is sometimes done in a will. This is sometimes done in an appendix. My issue with that is that people often are not updating their wills regularly, and that our financial balance sheets change more frequently than we are updating these documents. So now we have a document which is outdated. several years old, perhaps, or even from the 1990s. I've seen these, and it's unhelpful, right? But a letter of instruction, you could keep a digital letter of instruction and update it annually, probably in 30 minutes after you've written the initial draft. A list of debts, of course, right? Because whoever is helping settle the estate will have to settle the debts of the estate. Certain insurance policies, but especially life insurance, because people have to find and sort of track down the life insurance policies if there are any, write down the policy numbers, the contact broker, certainly the insurance company. Talked about funeral wishes. I talked about pets, and this one's very important. And this is probably a webinar in and of itself at some point in the future, but it's a key passwords and other cyber information. Our digital assets. So think about email accounts, social media profiles, digital photos, online banking, subscriptions, memberships, documents we keep in the cloud. Understanding what to do with those assets when we're gone is very important. And as increasingly more of our information gets moved to online sources versus physical sources, how to incorporate those assets into your estate plan. So you want to think about, who might need access to this if I was sick or after I'm gone? How do I grant access to those who may need it in the future? What do I want to do with these assets after I'm gone? Let me give you one example, sort of researching this webinar, and I didn't know this until I did some research, which is Facebook has what they call a legacy contact feature. And so this legacy contact is somebody who will be able to make decisions about your main profile after you're gone. So if you wanted your profile to be deleted, you could instruct that person to delete my profile if I pass away. But if you wanted a memorialization, so a place for friends and family to share memories about you after you're gone, you could appoint that legacy contact as the agent, if you will, for your social media profile. Really interesting. If you don't appoint somebody, then your memorial profile can't be changed. So that's just one example. There are lots of examples in our lives today of assets we have that are digital in nature and that we can set up in advance, just as we do, hopefully, with financial powers and healthcare powers to help us and go about making sure that our wishes are in fact respected after we're gone. It's a very important part, and again, generally not covered in other estate planning documents. Last but not least is something you can consider, and again, I want to be clear, just emphasize the letter of instruction is a blank slate. It can be whatever you want, but I think providing some guidance here is helpful. Some people choose to add a personal set of letter or set of instructions here in this letter as well. And so, what might you include? This might be a place to give advice on how you would like your survivors to think about spending their inheritance. So if you, just gifted your financial assets to your children, no strings attached, you might, in this section of your letter, talk about what you would like to see them do with that, right? So maybe it's funding education for the next generation. Maybe it's charitable intent. Maybe it's you'd like to see them retire sooner or travel the world. Whatever advice you might like to give that's attached to those assets, this can be an ideal place to communicate those ideas. You can think about communicating values and life lessons, right? Passing them on to the next generation to think about some sort of legacy, getting that in writing. And I think very importantly, this can be used as an area to explain why you made the choices that you did. If you, my earlier example, gifted to charity, you might want to explain here why you chose that charity or that charity's importance to your life and what you would like to think going forward. If your estate plan does not evenly split your assets among beneficiaries, you could explain at this point in the letter, why you made that decision, right? To help people understand after you're gone, to understand your intentions, your desires underlying your estate plan. So very important. It can be a way to fill in what otherwise is, quite honestly, with our formal estate planning document, something that's very cold and very legalistic, and putting some personality into it, putting some of yourself into your estate plan. All right, so those are the three parts of the estate plan that I think are really important, or the the three objectives of a letter of instruction that I think could be really, really helpful. Summarizing the estate plans and translating that into plain English, filling in the gaps of the estate plan, the parts that aren't covered by the will, the trust, the healthcare directive, financial power, and finally adding a personal touch to the extent that there are values you would like to impart. There are personal attachments to the decisions you've made and intent you'd like to communicate to the next generation. Letter of intention letter of instruction, can really help with all of those objectives. And the last thing I want to talk about today is, all right, well, what next? So this has been a sort of part of my practice for 12 years, and I've had conversations with lots of clients about the importance of something like this and how I think it'd be helpful. And I've also seen situations, unfortunately, where there weren't these instructions. And maybe, I think it's the 85% of us on this webinar today who said they either have not communicated any details of their estate plan or sort of only at a superficial level to the people that matter. How to get started on this. I want to give some actionable steps here that you could do right now, today, this weekend, that could get you from here to here and sort of on the way to getting this done, because I think it's very important. So firstly, right, consider contacting your attorney if you have a relationship and asking them if they'd write a summary of your estate plan. If it's been several years, it might be a good opportunity just to check in. The state tax laws and state planning laws have changed a lot in the last several years, especially with the Secure Act. Contact that attorney if we need an update, and if not, great, I'd like a summary, a cover letter explaining our estate plan for our friends and family. Alternatively, if you feel comfortable reviewing the documents yourself, it's a great opportunity to refresh your memory, right? Think about Albert Einstein's quote there, being able to explain something to a 6-year-old. If you can't do that, again, I recommend finding an attorney who can help you with it. Get your estate planning house in order. So organize those important documents. Everybody has a will, perhaps a trust, but we have deeds to properties, life insurance policies. It's all about these documents that would be important to somebody who is now managing your estate and organizing them in one place, right? Simplifying the balance sheet. I've worked with more than a number of clients who have 30 bank accounts, and it takes some time to reduce those bank accounts, to simplify the balance sheet. And people say, "Oh, but Frank, this is such a pain to do. I have to call them up. I have to fill out paperwork." Somebody will have to manage that. Somebody will have to simplify your balance sheet in the future. So do them a favor and get started on it today. And importantly, going back to the digital assets, think about a system for managing those assets. If you keep your usernames and passwords written down on paper, it's stored in a safe, make sure people know where to find that information, the people who need to know where to find that information. If you want to share that information, somehow in the cloud or in a secure document, find a technology solution and maintain that document over time. So as passwords change, you're updating them elsewhere so that people could access your digital assets in the future when they need to. Or if you're using a password manager, I think about something like LastPass. It's a popular password manager. They have a setting called an emergency access feature. So you can designate a spouse or a child to have access to your usernames and passwords upon your death. Right? All right, to the letter itself now. I have a couple of resources here. There's not a lot of resources online about letter of instruction, even though, again, I think it's a very, very potentially useful part of the estate plan. But there's not much writing on here. I have 3 sources here. Anybody who's on this webinar today will send you a follow-up. We'll include these 3 links in it. I understand you have the document with the hyperlinks in front of you, but these are resources, and I'm not saying I agree 100% with everything that's in these resources, but they're good resources. You know, pick and choose the parts of these articles that work for you and that speak to you, and then maybe different from what I'm recommending here in this webinar. But if it works, use it. And finally, I just gotten really sad having this conversation with clients over time, and no one ends up sort of getting started on this. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think when it comes to matters of death, it's very difficult for people to find motivation to think about this stuff, to write about this stuff. I think that there's potentially a lot of information. There's a lot to pull together, right? Summarizing the estate plan, getting all the parts of my estate sort of organized. How do I organize that? Where do I begin? So there's a sort of question of structure. Is there a structured way to do this? And finally, I think because unlike the formal estate planning documents, or if you're working with us, the financial planning documents, you sort of have a professional sort of helping you as a process in place, hopefully getting you from A to B to C. There doesn't seem to be any professionals who are helping people with this. And so I've attempted to put together a simple Word document here. It's just a template, essentially trying to organize things in terms of a balance sheet, in terms of important documents, insurance, contact information for important people. There's a section there about my pets. And I've organized it vis-a-vis the agenda today, right? Sort of estate planning summary, filling in the gaps information, and personal desires or values. So everyone on this webinar today will also get a link to that. I would really appreciate if you found that useful, if you found this webinar useful, to let me know, because it's really important for me that this webinar is not only or not just, I should say, sort of an academic discussion, but actually helps people get from understanding to action. So I hope you all find these resources useful. Let me just summarize this, and we're at a little bit over 30 minutes here. So a letter of instruction, right, is a valuable tool. I would argue a very valuable tool in your estate planning toolkit. A well-written letter can do at least these 3 things, right? Summarize your estate plan in plain English. It can provide details that aren't covered elsewhere, and it can add a personal touch. And finally, a letter won't write itself. So make a plan to write yours today. And my suggestions there on next steps, and we'll follow up with an email. I hope that advice sort of helps you get started along this process, and something you can get done certainly this year. So thank you very much. I have some time for Q&A, probably about 10 minutes here. I would be remiss if I didn't mention we're Sensible Financial Planning. We're the only financial planners with offices in Massachusetts and here in California. Here's my contact information. And these webinars we do on a monthly basis. The next webinar will be on TIPS ladders. TIPS are especially like treasury bond. TIPS ladders are buying bonds that mature at different times to mature to essentially match spending. And it'll be presented by Rick Miller, April 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. So thank you all very much. I hope this was helpful.
We do have some questions. We also have some comments. Someone says that setting up emergency contact info in a cell phone can help medical personnel know who to contact in case of an emergency. So that's a good thing to know. JC asks, in the absence of a will, do courts give significant weight to the letter of instruction?
That's a good question. I wouldn't know. I'm sure this varies by jurisdiction, right? Some jurisdictions allow holographic wills, others don't. I will say this: if you do not have a will, you have an estate plan. It's just the estate plan that the state has determined for you in advance. So if you don't have a will, don't rely on something like a letter of intent. You really need to get a formal estate plan put into place.
Oh, Teresa also suggests that there's a company called Everplans that
Mhm.
stores this type of information, but charges an annual fee. I don't know anything about the company myself. Are you familiar with them?
I am familiar with Everplan. We've looked at them in the past and had considered it for clients. It's been a while now, though. Again, I anticipate that there is a webinar here in my future about sort of digital assets and how to.
Mhm.
But thank you. I remember that company now, but it's been a while.
Here's a good question from Tom. Where should we keep the letter of instruction?
Good. That's very good, Tom. So there's lots of ways to think about this. And I think it depends on sort of how you care about the timing. If this is something that you don't want read until still it's needed, right? Until you're incapacitated or until after your death, then you store it in with that in mind, where it might be in a safe, personal safe in your home or something like that. Other people I know, use a cloud document, and so they share a Google Doc or something like that with friends and family, so that people have access to it. There's never any question. You could just, for example, give read-only access to people, and they'll always have it in their Google Doc. Now you have to be careful about security and what you put in a document like that. So if you're putting in account numbers or passwords, you really want to be careful about balancing the sort of access to information with security. But people do it digitally. People use it with actual physical paper. And I think it boils down to what's in the content of the letter and when do you want to communicate what's in that letter to the people who need to know.
I keep picturing an old mystery movie where only open this upon my death or something.
Right.
Um, okay. Someone asks, have you ever had a problem caused by a letter of instruction?
I have not. I'm not sure if you mean sort of like a legal issue or sort of a family problem, but of course, there's case law on this that somebody had instructions in a will, and the will was very old, and they had a letter, and that letter does not carry the force of law, but the instructions in that letter were very different from that of a will. So it is important. I want to be clear. It's the estate plan is something itself you should be reviewing once every other year, right, at a maximum, and to make sure that the instructions you have over here are in agreement with the instructions you have over here. But it can create problems in terms of legal force of weight. Remember, it's not a legal document, and so it does not carry the force of law to the extent that there are disagreements between that and a will or a trust.
So a couple of people have come forth and said that this webinar has been quite helpful. And then another person, Thomas, says he and his wife are going to approach her father, who has an estate plan and also a large art collection, but there's nothing in the will regarding the art.
Right.
They know from speaking to him that he wants the family to get it, and then certain institutions, and then sold. But would inclusion of that plan in a letter suffice, or does he have to revise his will and do a letter?
Yeah, so it depends, and this is where the help of estate planning attorney is essential, right? I've seen wills that are very, very broad in terms of again, I said the example, I leave all of my financial assets to my children. If you have language in the will along the lines of I leave all of my personal property, to Tom, including my paintings. Well, then it's very clear that the sort of where that property will go on somebody's death. But if the will is, you have to balance between being very, very broad and very, very specific, where it's broad and just says, I leave my property to all of my children. I mean, that's where a letter can be helpful to understand, well, what did dad want done with, for my father would be his fishing poles, right? And I'm assuming it's me, but it'd be nice to have that written down, right? If it doesn't carry the force of law, but something like an art collection, personal property of high value, I would think that would be best handled with very specific language in a will, as compared to sentimental personal property.
Well, first of all, Dwayne asks if we'll get a copy of the presentation or just the recording, and it's both. You're going to get, we'll email you the whole thing, this presentation, and you will also get the worksheet that Frank has created that is like a good template for putting your information together.
Right.
JC wonders if you have tips for avoiding inconsistencies between the letter of instruction and any other legal documents. As you mentioned, legal documents are quite complex.
Right. Right. And in the ideal world, we'd be sort of working with our estate planning attorney while doing this, and that attorney is going to have some advice, and this depends on the person. This depends on the professional. Some professionals say, in the will, have a list of all the personal property, and that's great. It's very specific, right? There are no questions. The problem I run into in the real world is that that asset list was put together in 2007, and now things have changed a lot. So I think you have to think about, well, how often am I really going to be, if it's a will, updating my will, and therefore, if I'm going to be doing this every other year, and I'm going to be very, very specific in that document, well then great. You may not need a portion of the letter that fills in the gaps of your assets and personal property, because that will is so up to date. If you may not do that, then you should make sure your attorney knows that, and you are sort of being flexible enough in that will, so that in the letter, which again is not legally binding, but that letter handles the disposition of your property and sort of the wishes attached to that property in such a way. So the two have to talk together. The two should sort of be in harmony. I think that begins with the estate planning attorney.
Let's see. Oh, Martha says, thanks for the motivation to better organize our estate planning and for the addition of a letter of instruction. As you say, we have a trust and a will, but we tend to ignore doing that extra step with an organizer to help executors and beneficiaries.
It is the low-hanging fruit of estate planning, right? It's and I've lost count how many times I've seen, the surviving children or surviving spouse, they're just sort of scratching their heads and saying, why wasn't this easier, right? Or what was going on here? Can avoid a lot of these problems just by being very, very simple and just sort of getting your house in order and explaining things in simple language, right? That's it.
A couple more people asking if they're going to get the presentation. Yes, you are. Someone says that Susie Orman has a will and trust kit online. This person found it easy to use, but Orman claims it will not need to be reviewed or filed anywhere by an attorney as long as the executor knows where to find the documents. I don't know.
I don't have that in front of me. That sounds very strange to me, because
yeah,
there are 50 different states with 50 different probate laws, right?
Right.
I will say this at sort of a more general level. I've been unimpressed with the sort of DIY estate planning solutions that are out there. I think it sounds great. There are these templates, and we can do it at our own pace, etc. But I think an attorney has an important role in the estate planning process, because the cost of getting it wrong are really, really high. And the cost of getting it done, really, it need not be onerous for people. It really does not need to be that way.
Okay, well, I think we've answered all the questions. Some good questions.
Yeah, there were. Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, and my biggest hope for everybody on this call is just sort of, going out and getting started on this. So again, I hope people found this useful. I hope the resources you'll get after this are useful to you, and would also just love to hear from people if they were able to actually sort of put pen to paper and make some progress on this as a result of this webinar. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, and we will see you on the next webinar.